We shall commence this module by discussing the Finance Commission. The Finance Commission is constituted by the President of India every 5 years under the Article 280 of Indian Constitution and lays the outline for the federal transfer of resources for the subsequent 5-year period. It has to provide recommendations on the sharing of union tax collections between the central government and the Indian state governments, various non-planned grants to be provided by the central governments to the state governments, measures that may be taken to augment the resources of the urban and rural local bodies which form the third tier of government in India. The Commission provides recommendations on specific areas as may be mandated by the President of India. The 13th Finance Commission for the year 2010 to 15 was mandated to review the finances of the Union and state governments and suggest measures for maintaining a stable and sustainable fiscal environment consistent with equitable growth under the chairmanship of Dr. Vijay L. Kelkar. After studying this module, you shall be able to understand the relevance of the 13th Finance Commission, know about the recommendations of the Commission, examine the criteria and weights for the devolution of Commission, and know about the fiscal corrections the Commission came up with. There are certain recommendations of the Finance Commission. Let us discuss them. Share of the states in the net proceeds of central tax collections fixed at 32% over the 13th Finance Commission's award period against 30.5% of 12th Finance Commission. Indicative ceiling for revenue transfers, that is taxes and grants from the centre to the states, set as 39.5% of the gross revenue receipts of the centre against 38% of 12th Finance Commission. Total grant to be provided by the centre to the state governments over 13th Finance Commission award period set at rupees 3,185.81 billion. Loans worth rupees 45.06 billion from Government of India to the state governments for centrally sponsored schemes and central planned schemes administered by ministries and departments other than Ministry of Finance to be written off. Interest rates on loans to the states from the National Small Saving Fund, that is NSSF, contracted till 2006-07 and outstanding at the end of 2009-10 to be reset at 9% with an assessed benefit of rupees 135.17 billion for the state governments. NSSF to be reformed into a market aligned scheme. Target for reducing the consolidated debt stock of the centre and the states set at 68% of gross domestic product by 2014-15, 45% of GDP for the centre and 25% of GDP for the states. Timelines specified for removal of revenue deficits and reduction in the financing gap of 3% of GDP for the centre and 3% of gross state domestic product, that is GSDP, for the states. Thereafter, the states are to maintain their financing gap at 3% of GSDP. Structural shocks such as payout of pay commission related arrears to be avoided by making the award take effect from the date of acceptance of the same. Borrowing limits for the states to be calculated by Government of India on the basis of the suggested fiscal reform path for the years between 2011-12 and 2014-15. Let's talk about sharing of union taxes. The 13th Finance Commission recommended that in terms of vertical distribution, the share of the states in the net proceeds of shareable union taxes be set at 32% for each of the years between 2010-11 and 2014-15. The proportion of the central tax devolution flowing to each state will be governed by the interset distribution recommended by the 13th Finance Commission for the years 2010-11 to 2014-15. The 13th Finance Commission's recommendations on central tax devolution and grants would serve to reduce the vertical imbalance between the centre and the states and are a positive from the point of view of fiscal federalism. The 13th Finance Commission related weights governing horizontal devolution has changed the interstate shares of Indian states within the overall pool of shareable taxes. Higher transfers would enhance the state's revenue receipts and thereby create fiscal space for the state governments to incur additional expenditure. In the event of macroeconomic shocks, additional resources to be raised by the centre and passed on to the states in accordance with the horizontal devolution formula. The population and area criteria and their respective weights are along the same lines as followed by the 12th Finance Commission. As these two criteria are equity neutral measures of fiscal need, the income distance criteria of previous finance commissions. This criteria measured the distance of the per capita GSTP of each state relative to the average of 3 states with the highest per capita income has been replaced by the fiscal capacity distance criteria to bring an element of equity into the horizontal devolution formula. The latter aims to ensure that all states have the fiscal capability to provide similar levels of public services to their population at comparable level of taxation. Since the fiscal discipline criteria captures the tax effort of states, the tax effort criteria has been dropped by the 13th Finance Commission. In order to incentivize fiscal prudence, 13th Finance Commission has increased the weight attached to fiscal discipline criteria to 17.5%, higher than the combined weight of fiscal discipline and tax effort set by the 12th Finance Commission, which was 15%. As far as local bodies are concerned, the total grant of rupees 3,185.81 billion to be provided by the centre to the state governments over the 13th Finance Commission award period includes an amount of rupees 875.19 billion for further transfer from the states to their local bodies, so would augment the revenues and improve the financial positions of the local bodies significantly. As far as fiscal roadmap is concerned, the 13th Finance Commission has suggested a revised fiscal roadmap for the centre and the states to provide the basis for sustainable adjustment of public finances going frontward. 13th Finance Commission has set a target of reducing the consolidated debt stock of the centre and states to 68% of GDP by 2014-15 from an estimated 82% of GDP in 2009-10. In accordance with the projected debt to GDP ratios over the 13th Finance Commission period, it has drawn up roadmaps for the centre and the states, which specify timelines for the elimination of revenue deficits and reduction in the financing gaps to 3% of GDP for the centre and 3% of GSDP for the states. This mechanism is expected to induce the states to adhere to the financing gap targets and would help maintain the focus on fiscal consolidation at the state level. Let us now talk about the interest rate on loans to the states. The 13th Finance Commission has suggested resetting of the interest rate on loans to the states from the NSSF to reduce the interest asymmetry between the centre and the states. The interest rate on loans contracted by the states from the NSSF until 2006-07 and outstanding at the end of 2009-10 is to be reset at 9% from either 9.5% or 10.5% at present based on the date on which the loans were contracted. This is estimated to provide a benefit of rupees 135.17 billion to the states over the 13th Finance Commission period. This Finance Commission has also recommended write-off of rupees 45.06 billion worth of loans from Government of India to the state governments administered by ministries or departments other than Ministry of Finance. The magnitude of these benefits is however small relative to the benefits that the states derive from the DCRF facility. Now moving on to discuss the grants. The 13th Finance Commission has recommended that grant of rupees 3,185.81 billion be provided by the centre to the states over the Commission's 5-year award period. The award is substantially higher than the rupees 1,426.4 billion that had been recommended by the 12th Finance Commission. The 13th Finance Commission has provided grants for the environment and for improving various outcomes of public expenditure. The latter include, among others, grants for improving justice delivery, for improving statistical systems at the state and district level, and for providing incentives for reducing infant mortality. The grants awarded by 12th Finance Commission for the environment include grants for forests, water sector management, and an incentive grant for grid connected renewable energy. The release of certain grants, including the incentive grants under the grants for environment and improving outcomes, as well as the performance grant for local bodies, are subject to various prescribed conditionalities to ensure that the states comply with the overall agenda in these sectors. As far as state specific grants are concerned, 13th Finance Commission has recommended that rupees 279.45 billion be provided as state specific grants to address specific concerns raised by the states. However, these grants will be available only to those states that comply with the condition to amend their Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act or enact FRBM acts in line with the fiscal correction path recommended by the 13th Finance Commission. Let us now discuss about the fiscal correction. In accordance with its terms of reference, the 13th Finance Commission has suggested a revised roadmap for fiscal consolidation for the centre and the states, which has been accepted in principle by the Government of India. It has drawn up a roadmap for fiscal consolidation for the states and the center, which includes a number of targets. Firstly, to reduce the consolidated debt stock of the center and the states to 68% of GDP by 2014-15. For the center, the target is 45% of GDP, and for the states it is 25% of GDP. Secondly, to eliminate revenue deficit over the long term. This is set as a long term and permanent target. Thirdly, achieving the target level of consolidated debt stock calls for a substantial correction from the level of debt stock at the end of 2009-10, estimated by the Commission at 82% of GDP. This was higher than the target of 75% of GDP that had been set for 2009-10 by the 12th Finance Commission. The inability to meet this target in 2009-10 is partly attributable to the macroeconomic slowdown and fiscal slippages in 2008-9 and 2009-10. The Commission has recommended that the centre's revenue deficit be eliminated and the financing gap be brought down to 3% of GDP by 2013-14. All states are to reduce their financing gap to 3% of GSDP. However, the timelines for compliance with this target vary. 19 states are to meet this target by 2011-12 and 7 states by 2013-14, while Jammu and Kashmir and Mizoram are to meet this target by 2014-15. Thereafter, the states are to maintain their financing gap to 3% of GSDP. The 13th Finance Commission had stated that the states should amend their FRBM acts or enact FRBM acts in case they have not done so to build in the specific fiscal reform path recommended by it. The 13th Finance Commission has also recommended reforms of the medium-term fiscal plan, which is to be made a statement of commitment rather than of intent, with tighter integration between the multi-year framework provided by the MTFP and the annual budgets in order to ensure adherence to the desired fiscal consolidation as suggested by the 13th Finance Commission. Next, we will discuss the borrowing limits. The 13th Finance Commission has recommended that the borrowing limits of the states for 2010-11 be set so that the financing gap does not exceed 3.5% of GSDP or the financial gap relative to GSDP in 2008-9, whichever is lower. It has also prescribed a floor of 3% of GSDP for states that had a financing gap less than 3% of GSDP in 2008-9. Accordingly, the borrowing limit for the states for 2010-11 will be effectively be set within a band of 3 to 3.5% of GSDP, which is expected to act as an implicit cap on the financing gap that any state can incur in the ongoing fiscal year. However, the Commission has not set any explicit target for the state's financing gap for 2010-11, which is designated as a year for adjustment and recovery. As a result, the financing gap of some states may exceed a band of 3 to 3.5% of GSDP in 2010-11, with public account funding possibly making up the difference between the financing gap and the borrowing limit. Now, we shall discuss about interest and debt relief. 13th Finance Commission has made two significant recommendations regarding interest and debt relief. It has recommended that interest rate on loans to the states from NSSF contracted until 2006-07 and outstanding at the end of 2009-10 be reset at 9% in order to correct the interest asymmetry between the center and the states. These loans carry an interest rate of either 9.5% or 10.5% at present, depending on the year in which the loans were contracted. Relief is to be provided on loans contracted until 2006-07, since a portion of the funds collected under the NSSF from the 2007-08 onwards was borrowed by the central government. The benefit of the interest reset is estimated at rupees 135.17 billion over the 13th Finance Commission period and at a total of rupees 283.60 billion over the life of the instruments concerned. The Commission has also recommended that the NSSF be reformed into a market-aligned scheme covering aspects including interest rate and tenure, following which Government of India has recently set up a committee to undertake a review of the NSSF structure as well as other administrative matters. It has recommended that the loans from Government of India to states administered by ministries or departments other than Ministry of Finance and outstanding at the end of 2009-10 estimated at rupees 45.06 billion at the end of 2007-08 by the 13th Finance Commission, which were not covered by the 12th Finance Commission under the Debt Consolidation and Relief Facility, that is DCRF, be written off. This recommendation has been accepted by the Government of India. Additionally, the Commission has suggested that the practice of the Centre providing loans to the states under centrally sponsored schemes be avoided in future. The Commission has reiterated the 12th Finance Commission's recommendation that the central government provide a borrowing window for fiscally weak states that are unable to raise funds from the market. Sikkim and West Bengal did not enact FRBM Act and were therefore not eligible for the benefits under the DCRF facility introduced by the 12th Finance Commission. The 13th Finance Commission has recommended that such states be made eligible for consolidation of central loans in accordance with the terms of the DCRF facility. However, the 13th Finance Commission has clarified that no further debt waiver would be extended on the central loans consolidated and rescheduled by the 12th Finance Commission. The rate reset on NSSF loans and the write-off of central loans are subject to amendment or enactment of the FRBM Act. No other conditions have been set by the 13th Finance Commission in this regard. The 13th Finance Commission has further stated that the debt write-off, it has been recommended, should not be accounted for in such a manner that it artificially depresses the revenue deficit or financing gap as was done by a number of states for the DCRF related debt waivers during the 12th Finance Commission period. In the end, let us summarize what we have discussed in this module. The Finance Commission is constituted by the President of India every 5 years under Article 280 of Indian Constitution and lays the framework for the federal transfers of resources for the subsequent 5-year period. The share of the states in the net proceeds of the central tax collections was fixed at 32% over the 13th Finance Commission's award period against 30.5% of 12th Finance Commission. Total grant to be provided by the centre to the state governments over 13th Finance Commission award period set at rupees 3,185.81 billion. The 13th Finance Commission associated weights governing horizontal devolution has changed the interstate shares of the Indian states within the overall pool of shareable taxes. Higher transfers would boost the state's revenue receipts, whereby creating fiscal space for the state governments to incur additional expenditure. Achieving the target level of the combined debt stock calls for a substantial correction from the level of the debt stock at the end of 2009-10, estimated by the Commission at 82% of GDP. This was higher than the target of 75% of GDP that had been set for 2009-10 by the 12th Finance Commission. The 13th Finance Commission suggested a revised roadmap for fiscal consolidation for the centre and the states, which was accepted in principle by the Government of India. The 13th Finance Commission has made two significant recommendations regarding interest and debt relief. It has recommended that interest rate on loans to the states from NSSF contracted till 2006-07 and outstanding at the end of 2009-10 be reset at 9% in order to correct the interest asymmetry between the centre and the states. It has also recommended that loans from Government of India to states administered by ministries or departments other than Ministry of Finance and outstanding at the end of 2009-10